Hey everyone, how's it going? Welcome back to InfoGamer. Thank you so much for clicking on this video. Today we're going to be adding another video to our playlist on how to recreate a Super Mario Run clone. Now if this is the first video that you've clicked on, make sure that you start at the beginning of this playlist so that you can follow along and create your own version of Super Mario Run. Also make sure that you like and subscribe to our videos and hit that notification bell so that you guys can get regular updates when we release new content. Now in the last video we showed you how to create the question mark block, and we were able to have our character hit it with his head and have an item or a coin pop out of the top of it. It was a lot of fun and it wasn't too difficult. In today's video we want to show you how to create the finish line for your levels. Now the finish line is a very important part to all Mario games. When you reach the end of the level, you come across a flagpole that has a Bowser flag flying on it. And when you touch the flagpole at a certain height, it gives you a certain amount of points, and then the Mario flag is raised as the Bowser flag is lowered. Once you reach the finish line, it then takes you back to the overworld where it then unlocks the next level for you to play. Now we probably won't be able to replicate everything exactly the way they have it in Mario Run, but we're going to try our best. Now let's get started. So here we have our project open in Unity. I'm going to go ahead and hit play so that we can make sure everything is working properly. So here we have our character and we can run, and we can also hit the question mark blocks and coins pop out of the top of them. And so that's all working quite nicely, and I'm able to collect the coins and continue on. And our game over scene, our death zone, is working as well. So it looks like nothing's broken and everything's working properly. So the first thing that I want to do is create a new scene that we can load to once we reach the finish line. So I'm going to hit File, New Scene, and then let's go ahead and just save this scene as a new scene. So we're going to hit Save Scene As. We're going to then find our Scenes folder and we can rename this to Overworld. Once you've created this new scene, let's go to File and then select Build Settings. Then we want to drag in our scenes in the order that we want them to load in our game. So the first scene that we're going to load is the Overworld, and then the next scene is the game scene. Now real quick, let's add a button to our Overworld scene so that we can load into the first level and go back and forth between the two. So I'm going to go to Create in the hierarchy, go to UI, and then select Button. Once I create that, we can then change the name of the button to something like Start Button. And now what we need to do is create a new empty game object, which is going to be the main menu controller, or the Overworld controller. So we could type Overworld controller. And I'm going to drag it out so it's not a child of the canvas. Now we need to create a script that we can put all our Overworld controls on and then attach it to this game object. So I'm going to go to our scripts folder, I'm going to right click, go to Create, C# script, and then let's call this Overworld controller. Let's go ahead and open the script in Visual Studios. Once you have the script open in Visual Studios, let's go ahead and delete the start and update function for now. And then let's create a public void function, and this is going to be the start button. Now we probably won't keep any of this in the future once we start building our Overworld scene, but for now this function will serve the purpose of loading in the game scene so that we can go in between our Overworld scene and our game scene without having to restart our game. Once we've created this function, we then need to go up to the top and add a new namespace. We're going to say using, and then it's called Unity Engine Scene Management. Once we have this line, we can then load in the next scene. So I'm going to say Scene Manager, and then .load scene. And then we want to just load the scene number 1. So the 0 scene is the Overworld, and the scene 1 is our game scene. Once we have this function, let's go ahead and save our script and go back to Unity. We then need to select our button, and I'm going to focus in on it in the scene. And it looks like it's not visible in our canvas, so I'm going to drag it up. Let's just go ahead and center it in the X direction and the Y direction. And that'll work for now. Then what we need to do is add the onClick function, Before we do that, we actually need to attach our Overworld script to our Overworld controller object. We then want to select our Start button and then drag in the Overworld controller object to this field here on the onClick. And if you don't see this here, then you can go ahead and hit this plus button, and this should then give you an option for your onClick. So once we've dragged in that object, let's go to the No Function drop-down menu, select Overworld Controller, and then find our Start button function. So now when I hit play, I can then click the button and we can load in the scene. Let's also change the text of the button. So I'm going to select the text child object of the Start button, and let's just change this to play. Now let's go back to our game scene. So I'm going to select our scenes folder and then double click on our game scene. I'm going to make sure that I save the overworld scene. Now 2 videos ago we showed you how to create the death zone, and we added in comments to our script saying that we wanted to load in the overworld scene. But we didn't have an overworld scene to load in. We probably could have created it then. But now that we've created it, let's go back to our script and add in a line of code that will load us back to the overworld scene. So I'm going to go ahead and open our player controller script in Visual Studios. And once I've opened it in Visual Studios, I'm going to scroll down to our onTriggerEnter function, which is right here. And here we have the if other.transform.tag equals death zone. We then call the coroutine death, and the coroutine is right here. And here's the comment that I was talking about, where we say load scene overworld. And so right here we can just add a new line of code, which we're going to say scene, and we actually need to add the namespace first. So I'm going to scroll up to the top, go using Unity engine dot scene management. Okay, now I'm going to scroll back down to our death coroutine, death function coroutine, and let's add in the scene manager and then say dot load scene, and we're gonna this time load in the 0 scene, which is our overworld. Let's go ahead and save that. And now when we go back to Unity and I hit play, as our character is running, and once we reach that gap in the floor, I can then jump into the gap, and as I land, it'll say game over, and then it'll wait a few seconds, and then it'll load us into the overworld, and we can then resume playing. And so that's working quite nicely. Although that camera's not following our main character. Why is that? Alright, so I found out the reason why the camera isn't following our main character right here when we load back into the game scene after dying once. And the reason why is because if we go over to the player controller script, here we are setting our isAlive Boolean variable to true, but we don't set it true anywhere else. And so this is being called when we start the game, but it's not being called every time we load the game scene. So what we can do to fix this is we can then just copy the isAlive equals true, and we can then paste it into the start function as well. This will make it so that every time we load the game scene, we then set this static variable to true, which will then allow our camera to follow our main character, because we're only following the main character with the camera if the isAlive variable is set to true. Now let's go ahead and save this and test it one more time. So here I'm about to die, and there we go, we have the game over. And now we have the play button, and as I hit play, we can then see that the camera is now following our main character. So there we go, we've now fixed that bug. Alright, it's now time to start creating the finish line prefab. And once we create this finish line prefab, you're going to be able to drag it into the scene at the end of each level, and it's going to work the same way in all your levels. So since this object is a flagpole, let's start by creating a cylinder, and Unity provides cylinders. So I'm going to go create, and then I'm going to go 3D object and find cylinder right here. We can then zero it out in the transform, and I'm going to focus in on it in the scene. I'm going to delete this question mark block from our scene so I can work on our cylinder without that block getting in the way. Now, so since this is supposed to be a flagpole, let's make this cylinder really skinny but really tall. So I'm going to select our cylinder and I'm going to scale it down in the X and the Z direction to 0.25. And then in the Y direction, let's make it 4 tall. And then we can drag it up so the bottom of it is touching the brick. All right, next we want to create the actual flag, which is going to animate from the bottom to the top of the flagpole. But before we do that, let's go ahead and rename our cylinder, and I'm just going to call it Finish Line. Now I'm going to go ahead and create the flag object. So I'm going to click on Create in the hierarchy, and then let's select 3D Object, and I'm going to create a plane. Now previously I went ahead and downloaded an image of an American flag that I'm going to apply to this plane, and then we're going to scale it down to fit the flagpole. So if I go to my textures folder, here you can see that I have this American flag and I need to create a material for it. So I'm going to go to Materials folder, I'm going to right click, go Create Material, and then let's just name this to be Flag, and then going to go to our textures folder and drag in our flag texture to the albedo field. We then want to change the rendering mode to cut out, and that's going to cut out all the white from the background. We can then turn the smoothness down to 0, and I'm going to then select this material and drag it onto the plane. So there we go, we have an American flag on this plane. Now let's go ahead and rescale and position this object. So the first thing that I'm going to do is rotate the object. So let's try 90 degrees, and then we can rotate it 180 in the Y. That'll get it facing the right direction. I'm then going to drag it over so that it lines up with the flagpole. I'm then going to go ahead and scale this object. So I've selected the scaling tool by clicking R on the keyboard, and I'm going to drag it down to right about there, and we can then scale it in. We want it to be fairly small, so something like that. We can then drag it over so it lines up with the flagpole again. Maybe it should be a little bit bigger, but I think I got the proportions correct, so I'm going to drag it out like that, and there we go. We have the American flag. Now what I want to do is line it up perfectly with the bottom of the flagpole. So let's go ahead and make this flag, and we can rename the object to flag, and then we can drag it onto the finish line object. So I'm going to select it, drag it on as a child, and then we can zero out its transform, and we want to then drag it over to the right so it lines up, and then drag it down in the Y direction so it lines up with the bottom there. Now you at home can use whatever texture you want for your flag. You could even create your own flag, or a flag that matches your character, kind of like the Mario flag matches Mario. One thing that might even be cool is if you were to add a cloth sim to your flag so that it actually acts like a flag. The next thing that we need to do is create the animations for our flag. So to do this, I'm going to select our finish line object, and then I'm going to open our animation window. So I'm going to go Window and then Animation, and then it popped up on my other screen, so I'm going to drag it over and anchor it right there. Now let's go ahead and create a folder in which we're going to save our animation. So I'm going to right click on our Assets folder, go to Create Folder, and let's just name this Animations. We then want to, with the finish line selected, hit this Create button. We can then go into our Animations folder and give our animation a name. So this first one is going to be our idle flag animation. So with this animation, we need to add a property. So I'm going to select Add Property, and let's go to our flag object. Now we never want to change the transform of the parent object, and what we would normally do is we'd have an empty object, an empty game object that we have as the root object of our flagpole, and we're just going to pretend that the flagpole itself is the root object. And what that means is we should never really change the transform of that root object. If we do, then it's going to pop our object to that position, which if we want it to animate in local space, we don't want to have happen. And so I'm going to expand our flag child object, and then I'm going to select transform and then position, and then I'm just going to leave everything else the same. And with that, we should have our idle animation. Now we want to go ahead and create an animation for the flag raising to the top of the flagpole. So I'm going to select this drop-down menu, go to Create New Clip, and make sure I'm in the animation folder, and then we can rename this to Raise Flag. What we want to do is expand the flag object, and here we have a few more options. So we have Is Active, and we have Transform, Mesh Collider, and Mesh Renderer. But what we want is the transform, and we want the position. So I'm going to click this plus button here. So here we have 60 frames in between our 0 frame and our 1 second frame, and you can see that with this sample rate. So right now it's set to 60 frames. Now what we can do is probably make the raising of the flag be half a second. So I'm going to drag that end keyframe over to 30 seconds, and then I'm going to expand the position property, and let's raise up the Y. I'm going to make sure that this record button is selected. So there we go. And let's raise up the Y with our timeline at the 30-second mark. I'm going to raise it up to the top of the flag. And what we could actually do is just select the flag and drag it up. So right about there. Now what we can do is we can play through this animation, make sure the timing feels good. So that might even be too quick. I don't know, we'll have to play around with it a little bit, but if we wanted to make it 1 second, we could drag the end keyframe back to 1 second, and then we could play through it again. Yeah, I feel like that's pretty good. So now that we have all the animations created, let's go to our animator window where we can then create the transitions. So here we have our animations, and we can see that we have the idle flag animation, and it's highlighted in orange, which means that it's the default animation. And that's what we want. We want the idle flag animation to be the default one, because that's going to be the first one that plays. Now let's go ahead and create a new parameter. So over here in this left panel, I'm going to make sure that parameters is selected. I'm going to hit this plus button, and let's create a boolean, and let's rename it to be winner. And then what we can do is we can then create a new transition from our idle flag animation to our raise flag animation. And when we select this transition, we can then make sure that has exit time is unchecked. And the reason why we want to uncheck this is because if we have it checked, then as soon as the idle flag animation finishes its animation, it will then transition straight into the raised flag animation, which is what we don't want. And so what we can do is with this transition selected, we make sure that's turned off, and then we add a condition, and we just make sure that winner is set to true. This will make it so that when we collide with the flag, we can then specify that we want this parameter, the winner parameter, to change from false to true. And once that happens, it'll make that transition for us. Now there's one more thing that we'll need to do. Let's go into our animations folder and select each of these animations. We want to make sure that loop time is unchecked, because these are animations that we only want to play once. So once you have all your animations and your animator controller set up, let's go ahead and start scripting our finish line. So let's go into our scripts folder, and I'm going to go ahead and open our player controller script. Once you have your player controller script open, we want to scroll down to the bottom where we have our onTriggerEnter function. Now we have an onTriggerEnter function, and we have an onControllerColliderHit function, but what we don't have is an onColliderHit function. So below our onTriggerEnter function, I'm going to type void and then onColliderEnter. And so the autocomplete created this private void onCollisionEnter, and then the parameters are collision, and it's called collision with a lowercase c. So inside this onCollisionEnter function, the first thing that we want to do is check to see if the collision.transform.tag is equal to, and let's say finish line. So when this if statement is true, this is when we want to play the animation of our flagpole. So in curly braces, I'm going to first get the animator component from the other object that we collided with. So I'm going to say collision.gameObject.get component, and let's get the animator component, then parentheses, And what we want to then do is say set bool, and then we need to get the name, which is winner. And then we need to set the value, which is true. The next thing that we want to do is remove all player controls from the user. And so to do this, let's create a new Boolean variable. So up at the top, I'm going to, underneath is alive, that's a good place to put it. Let's say public, and this will be a bool. We probably don't need to make it static. And let's say is winner. And then let's say equals false. And at the beginning of each game, we can make sure that it's set to false. So is winner. I'm going to set it equal to false. Now I'm going to scroll down to our onColliderEnter function, and inside this if statement, I'm going to say is winner equals true. We now want to scroll up to our update and fixed update functions. So here we have our fixed update function where we are setting the gravity, the jump, the forward movement, and the speed apply. So the two functions that we want to block from the user's control is the jump and the forward movement function. And so to do this, let's add an if statement, and we're going to check to see if winner is equal to false. And if it's equal to false, then we'll allow the players to do the jump and the forward movement function. But if it's equal to true, we want to skip over these functions. Once you have that if statement, let's go ahead and scroll back down to our onColliderEnter function. So right here. Now what we want to do is load in the overworld scene because our players have completed that level. And so to do this, let's create a new coroutine, and what we actually probably could do is just use this same coroutine, the death coroutine. And I'm actually going to do that. I'm going to say start coroutine, and then I'll call death. Now we could give this coroutine a different name. We could say death and win, but virtually it does the same thing. We could also just get rid of this debug.log statement where we're saying game over. Now the major difference between a death and a win in Mario is that when you have a death, it subtracts a life from your character, whereas if you win, it unlocks the next level. Now we need some sort of numerical value to keep track of which levels we've unlocked. So to do this, for now what we can do is just scroll up to the top and create a new static variable. So in our player controller script, I'm going to say public, and then we'll say static, and this will be an int, and we could call this level counter. Now this works best if all the levels are linear, meaning that when you finish level 1, it then unlocks level 2, which then unlocks level 3, and so on. And for the most part, all the Mario games have a linear level flow. But sometimes you'll have branching where you could either go to level 4 or you could skip it and go to level 5. And so you'll need at some point in your game to be able to specify, oh, at this point I want to unlock level 4 and level 5, and then let the players choose which level they want to go to. I remember a very specific example of Super Mario Bros. 3 in the very first world, where I think it was level 4. You could either skip it and go straight to level 5, or you could do it and get a mushroom. And level 4 had like the camera was constantly moving forward, and so it made the game a lot harder, the level. And I would always skip it because when I played it I was really little and it wasn't very good. But this will work for now. Now another variable that we're going to need is we're going to need to create a public int, and this is going to be the current level. So we could say current level. Now what we would probably want to do is eventually move these variables to a level controller script, but we don't really have a level controller script, so I'm just going to keep them on our player for now. Now the level counter is going to specify which levels we have unlocked, whereas the current level is going to be the current level that we're playing. And if the current level is greater than the level counter, we'll then increment the level counter on completion. So let's scroll back down to our onColliderEnter function. So right here before the start of our coroutine, I'm going to add an if statement, and this if statement is going to check to see if the level counter is equal to the current level. And if it is, then I want to increment our level counter. photo. So the reason I'm checking to see if level counter is equal to current level is because we want to make sure that the player is playing the last unlocked level. If I were to change the sign of this if statement to say something like level counter is greater than current level, then that would mean that we're playing level 1 when we should be playing level 5, and if we allow the player to increment the level counter, then they could go back to level 1 and just keep unlocking levels without really progressing and playing any of the other levels. But by having this if statement checking to see if they're equal, then we know that they are playing the current level that they should be playing in order to unlock the next level. Now, this if statement isn't really applicable for us now, but once we create our overworld and we have levels that can be unlocked, this is kind of the mechanism that we're going to be using to unlock those levels. Let's go ahead and save this script, and let's go back to Unity. Now there's a few more things that we need to do. With our finish line selected, I'm going to make sure that we create that finish line tag, and there's actually a finish tag, so I'm going to select that and go back to our script and change it from finish line to just finish, and that way we don't have to create a new tag. So now that we have our flagpole tagged, I'm going to go ahead and remove the mesh collider from our plane or our flag child object. So I'm going to say remove component. So the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to create a prefab out of this finish line. So I'm going to select our finish line and drag it into our prefabs levels folder. And there we go. We now have our flag object in our prefabs folder. Now the last thing I'm going to do before I hit play is position our finish line at the end of our level. So I'm going to drag it over and I'm going to put it on this platform down here, right at the end. So right about there. That looks pretty good. Okay, now what we can do is we can add the finish line to our level object. So I'm going to make it a child, and then we can collapse our level, and there we go. It's all nice and neat inside one continuous level object. Now we're super close to hitting play, but there's one thing that we need to fix. I've been telling you guys something wrong, and I just realized it. Let's go back to our player controller script. Now we've been putting everything for this video inside the onCollisionEnter function, which I thought would work considering that we're using an onTriggerEnter function, which is working just fine. But it turns out that because we're using a character controller component and not a rigid body, that the onCollisionEnter function doesn't work. This makes me kind of sad because I was wanting to use the onCollisionEnter function because it only executes once when two objects collide with each other. But it turns out that we're going to have to use the onControllerColliderHit function. And so what we're going to do to fix this is cut everything out of this onCollisionEnter function, and then we can just go ahead and delete the onCollisionEnter function. And then what we want to do is scroll up to our onControllerColliderHit function, which is right here. Now at the top of this function, let's paste in everything that we've cut out of the other function. And then you can see here that we're getting red squiggly lines under collision because the collision parameter doesn't exist anymore. And so what we need to do is change the collision parameter to the hit parameter of this function. And that should do it. That should fix all the problems. Let's go back to Unity and test it out. So here we have our character, and as he's running, I'm going to see if I can make it to the end of our level. Hopefully I don't fall into the gap because that's the only way I can die. Whoa, that was close. Alright, now I just need to do these wall jumps. Everything's working fine. And now when I fall off this ledge and land on this platform, I can then jump and run into the flag, and I can't click the screen anymore, and it loads us back to the overworld. And then when I hit play, you can see that our game starts again and I'm back at the beginning of our level. And there you have it. We've now created the finish line for our Super Mario Run game. Now there's a lot more that we could do with the finish line. We could have confetti shoot out of the base of the finish line or fireworks in the background. We could have a congratulations banner pop up or have our Mario character do a little dance. We could also have our Mario character actually grab onto the flagpole like he does in Mario, but we would have to create an animation specifically for that. We could also make sure that we create all our own art assets for the flagpole and make it look very professional. There's also a lot that we could do instead of a flagpole. If we feel like a flagpole is too much like Mario and we want to come up with our own thing, I highly recommend that you be a little creative and you create something entirely different. Now, if you enjoyed this video and found it helpful, make sure that you like and subscribe to our videos. Hit that notification bell so you can get regular updates when we release new videos. Also, make sure that you share with your friends because it's always fun to work in groups. Hope you have a great day and we'll see you next time.